Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to Second Opinion, the show where the student actually listens to their professor. I'm joined today with Dr. Katina Lillios. Would you like to introduce yourself really quickly?
Sure. I'm Katina Lillios. I'm a professor in the Department of Anthropology, and I'm an archaeologist, and I have been teaching at the University of Iowa for about 21 years.
Perfect, and can you just explain to me really quickly, in your field of anthropology, what is your main study of focus?
Sure. I study the prehistoric ancient peoples that lived in Portugal and Spain between about 5,000 and 3,000 years ago in what we call the late Neolithic to the Bronze Age. So I'm a prehistorian that focuses on ancient societies and peoples that lived in the Iberian Peninsula. Yeah.
Perfect, and so in a real simple way, because I know this can get really technical, can you describe what life was like for early humans in the Iberian Peninsula?
Sure. Well, Iberia, or the Iberian Peninsula, had a very long history of human occupation. I mean, actually, there's evidence for humans or hominids, because they're not modern humans, for at least 1 million years. So there's a long, long history, again, of human occupation or hominid occupation. But the people that I let's say, are interested in, the societies that I'm interested in, lived, as I said, between about 5,000 and around 3,000 years ago. And they were farming peoples, they were herders, they traded in all kinds of materials, they were craftsmen, and they traveled around quite a bit. They moved through at least parts of North Africa, other parts of Iberian Peninsula, and my interest has been in sort of how did these societies, how were they organized? Where did they get their stuff, their raw materials? And what was the nature of the hierarchies and the power structures at that time? So that's really been my focus.
So I guess we'll start first based on that first aspect, what you focused on. What were the structure of the societies like in this prehistoric Iberian area?
Well, that's a really great question. I mean, they're what we call complex societies. Broadly speaking, there were people that were organized in a way that there were certainly at least material evidence for some social differences. There were clearly some individuals who lived in these societies and communities that were special, and we only know this because of the kinds of objects that they're buried with, very, very exotic goods, let's say ivory that came from North Africa, or thousands of beads that were made by some sort of shell. So we have indications of some social distinctions. But on average, I would say, there was a fairly high level of sort of equality or egalitarianism, even though there are these kind of expressions of difference as well. So my interest has been sort of like how much of each and then how did it change over time and how was it based? How were these differences, on what basis did they get formed?
What evidence so far do you know how they were formed? Was it geographical factors? Were it resource factors?
Yeah.
Do we have any idea yet?
These are great questions. I mean, what we can say is that, the sites, the settlements were places where people lived. So we distinguish between settlements and burial sites, at least in my part of the world. So the settlements that are the biggest and that had the longest occupations, longest period of history, longest endurance of history, are places that are agriculturally rather rich. They have river valleys, they have ample resources nearby, but they also seem to have access to important raw materials like stones for making axes, which were kind of critical to living a life of a farmer and a farmer, someone who needed to cut their wood and plow their fields and work other materials. So these people, at least the settlements that again seem to have had access to a certain degree of affluence, did seem to have both a solid agricultural base, but also access to exchange networks, so they could get stuff that wasn't like right nearby.
Now, so you mentioned before, so these were the settlements, but we also had evidence of burial sites. What were you finding from the burial sites? Was there evidence of order there, some sort of religion? What have we found so far based off these sites?
Well, the burials of this time period are really quite fascinating, actually. Many of the sites from this time period. First of all, they buried their dead collectively, which is a very different way of treating the dead than we do in our society here in the United States. So that means that when you dig a burial site, whether it's a cave or it's a stone structure, you might have 10, 20, 30, 100, 200 bodies or remains of bodies left behind. So that was already sort of one marker of their way of treating the dead. But the burials come in different kinds of spaces. I think some of the most dramatic forms are the tombs that are made of stone blocks. Basically, this is the time of Stonehenge, right? So we all know about Stonehenge and their great skills in accessing and quarrying and shaping large, monumental-sized stones. Well, they were doing this in Spain and Portugal as well, but they were architecturally quite different. And they spent a lot of energy making these kinds of stone monuments, with chambers and a capstone and sometimes corridors. Some of these stones weigh multiple tons, and they house their dead in these spaces. So first of all, these monuments, because of their monumentality, tell us that they, first of all, were willing to spend a lot of labor and effort to find a home or place their dead in a home. But they also were organized. I mean, you can't move these stones around by yourself. They didn't have tractors and things like that. So they were very skilled, architects, engineers, and they knew how to get people together to build these stones, and so to build these monuments. So that's, I think, one of the more interesting aspects of their burial sort of landscape and tradition. And of course, within the burials, within the tombs, you'll find, of course, many bodies, many skeletons associated with lots of goods that some people got more of than others, but they're very interesting spaces. That's a long answer to your question.
That was a great answer, and it's really interesting because if we go further back towards the time of Neanderthals and Homo habilis, we have evidence based on the way they died and the trauma towards their skeletons that we can tell, the Neanderthals lived a very rough life. Do we have evidence that life in this ancient Iberia was exceptionally traumatic, or was it more easy than compared to other areas of the world?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and there are specialists who focus on that question. They're bioarchaeologists, I don't do that work. There are people who specialize in sort of biology and human anatomy and the study of pathologies and things. But and we have a lot of individuals preserved, so we have a lot of, let's say, data to answer that question. But surprisingly, there's a pretty high level of health seen in these individuals. In fact, signs of disease is relatively rare. Actually, cavities, even caries, is a relatively rare occurrence among the people at this time, and that's not necessarily a sign that they were healthy, eating good food, but they probably didn't have access to a lot of sugar and sweet things that might, lead to sort of dental decay. I mean, occasionally we do find trauma, evidence of injuries, arrowheads stuck in, people's scapulas and things like that. But that it's actually a relatively rare occurrence. So for all the difficulties that must have existed for these folks, it seems that in general, they had a fairly healthy life, although it was a fairly short life, right? Okay, I mean, they tended not to live much beyond 40 or so, 50, 60. So, there was a lot of loss of life, in the early years of people's lives from probably things that we can easily cure nowadays. So, yeah.
And so going off that, a part of anthropology and archaeology is kind of connecting how the past buildup of complex societies can affect our modern one. Do you have any kind of input as to how their short way of life may have influenced later periods of this region?
Well, that's a tough question to answer. I mean, of course, all people draw on the knowledge of their past, their ancestors or their more distant past. And we certainly have evidence that, let's say in the Neolithic and Copper Age sites, that there sometimes are occupations that extend beyond that in the Bronze Age or Iron Age or Roman period and that sort of thing. So people must have been aware of the stuff, that they were encountering in the same hills or valleys or caves or wherever they were living. We do have some evidence. For example, I mean, some of the more interesting kind of examples of this, like in the Roman period. So the Romans obviously, expanded their empire into Iberia. They sometimes ran into stone axes that these Neolithic peoples had made and left behind in fields and what have you. And they sometimes reused these axes as kind of amulets or talismans to protect their houses against lightning. So sometimes in Roman sites, you'll see tucked away in a wall or a house foundation a Neolithic axe. Now, how that influenced people's way of thinking is not entirely clear, but what is clear is that they were aware of some more ancient peoples. They obviously found some power in these objects that were clearly old, in their own religious, thinking. So you could say that these places did influence later peoples, but it's often more difficult to say because a lot of them didn't leave records of what they were thinking, right? My period is prehistoric, right?
Right.
The Bronze Age, prehistory. We don't know what they were thinking, but they sometimes did reuse these older things, which is interesting.
Now, going to your personal work, so have you ever worked in the field of archaeology?
Yeah.
Has there ever been an instance where you guys were finding something and you were thrown for a loop? Has there ever been a time when you're like, whoa, this completely changes my mind about how things were?
Well, yes. So sometimes we find things. I've excavated a number of sites. As a director of excavations, I dug a Bronze Age site, a Bronze Age settlement in Portugal for my dissertation. I directed excavations of a burial site also in Portugal about 10 years ago or so. And those are the sort of two main field projects that I've worked on. And in both of them, sometimes we find things, often on the last day of the excavation. I mean, that's a very classic story that, the last day you find something that just kind of throws you off. But yeah, we found some in the burial site that I excavated in Portugal, again dated to around 3000 BCE. We did find some objects that I had never seen before. Some carved stone balls, actually. I mean, for lack of a better word, rounded stone objects with markings on them that I'm like, I've never seen this before. And as soon as we found them, I photographed them and sent it to my friends in Spain and Portugal. I'm like, guys, have you ever seen this before? And they're like, no. So yeah, occasionally you find things that you've just never seen. I mean, that's the exciting thing about archaeology. It's you don't really know what you're going to find, and these things challenge you to kind of think, creatively and thoughtfully about what are the possible things that this object could have functioned as or meant. So yeah. But again, always on the last day of the excavation.
Now, based off your experience, how do you see archaeology kind of developing in the modern era of the future? We have a lot of new technology, we have a lot of new understanding of complex societies.
Yeah.
Is that changing, or do you think it's largely remained consistent over the years?
Ooh, that's a really, really great question. Well, one of the things that newer technologies allows us to do is to, let's say, survey or take photography or images of landscapes, large landscapes, through drones and other kinds of pieces of equipment, and create maps and also see through vegetation, so we can sort of see architecture that may not be visible so easily on the ground. So those sorts of technologies that are expensive, by the way, do allow us to kind of create images, maps, see things that otherwise not so easily seen of spaces where complex people living in sort of complex societies lived in a much quicker way than in the old days when I was a graduate student and we had to kind of cut the vegetation and do the maps ourselves. So it does allow us to sort of create images and ideas of architecture without having to disturb the soil, without having to excavate, and that's a change in the sort of archaeological practice, that we tend to sort of avoid digging unless we have to, right? Because digging is fundamentally destructive. I mean, digging excavating, pulling out stuff from the ground, ultimately destroys a site, right? But if you can take images and get maps made without having to disturb a site, that's a good thing. So for complex societies, that's really important because they tend to be bigger. These tend to be bigger kinds of sites. So, yeah.
Perfect. Now I just have one last question for you.
Sure.
Right now, at this very moment, what is one thing you hope to be found in Spain and Portugal? One thing that you never had the chance to really get a hold of it, but you know it's out there and you can't wait for them to find it.
Well, this ties into one of my projects that I've been involved in for over 20 years now. Actually, it's related to this, these things.
Oh,
I don't
wow.
know.
Wow.
The camera. So this is a replica, by the way. This is not a real archaeological piece, but this is a very decent replica of a slate plaque. Obviously, so slate that was engraved. And these objects were found, or replicas, or real versions of these kinds of objects were found in burials that I've been talking about. These megaliths and caves and things of the late Neolithic and Copper Age. And I've spent a lot of time cataloging them and studying them, and working with people to understand the ways that they were made and look for geographic patterning. And I have a hypothesis that they were a kind of recording system of a genealogy, so a kind of writing system in a prehistoric people, which of course seems like a contradiction in terms. So if I could, wish for anything, I would really love to have a burial found with a bunch of these plaques in association with a bunch of people that were in good preservation, so that we can maybe learn something about their genetic relationships, the relationships to each other, and use that to kind of test the hypothesis that these plaques were being used to mark the relationships of people, certain people at time of death. So we have yet to find that kind of site, but I think it's perfectly possible. So that's my wish. That's
really interesting because I'm no archaeologist, but I can see what you mean though, because some of them have more distinct scratchings on them, and you can say, oh, well, it's almost like maybe a Punnett square type thing or a phenotype where it's like, oh, or some kind of distinction of this many scratches means this relation, or this amount of scratches means this relation. I get what you're saying.
Yeah. Now, if you saw them,
that's really interesting.
If you saw them, again, I have about 1,800 of them in my database, and you can see that they're awfully similar to each other, but they're all unique. And so, we see evidence of corrections in some of them. So I think they were deliberately, in the past, deliberately, intentionally, making these things to sort of communicate something very specific, and it had to be done right, and had to be, with certain kinds of people. So, yeah, but this is a hypothesis, and the testing of the hypothesis would be through the finding of a wonderfully preserved site.
Perfect. That was great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you so much for watching. This has been Second Opinion. I was joined today by Dr. Katina Lillios, who is a professor and former archaeologist, right?
No,
you're still
doing
it. You're still doing it. Still out in the field
right
now. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you in the next episode.